Full disclosure, this is probably the best made movie that I'm ever gonna review. Let's just get the ranking out of the way first. 10 evil smirks out of 10. Let's be real. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about what makes Psycho one of the best made movies in my opinion. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribe to this channel and click that little bell thingy to get notified. I post regular movie reviews and gameplays, all with a horror theme to them, so trust me when I say that you won't want to miss what's coming. Don't believe me? Stick around to the end of the episode to find out what movie I'll be discussing next time. Okay, so the story of Psycho really begins back in 1957, when Ed Gein was arrested for the murder of 2 women. When police searched his house, they found that Gein was actually an avid grave robber as well, taking corpses back to his house for, decorations. He fashioned chair seats out of human skin, bowls from human skulls. But perhaps the most applicable here would be the masks, leggings, and corsets that he made using female body parts, which led investigators to believe that he was trying to make a woman's suit so that he could pretend to be his mother. His mother, Augusta Gein, was a deeply religious and domineering woman who would preach to her sons about the inherent immortality of the world and especially of women, who she believed to be, to put it politely, Satan-worshipping whores by nature. Augusta had a stroke in 1944, after which Ed dedicated himself to taking care of her, and he was completely devastated by her death a year later. From there, it was all a downward spiral into a fascination with cannibalism, Nazis, and collecting vulva in a shoebox. But why am I bringing all this up? Well, writer Robert Bloch lived 35 miles away from Gein, and 2 years after his arrest, he published his best-known work, Psycho. Bloch claims that the similarities between fictional serial killer Norman Bates and real-life grave robber Ed Gein are completely incidental, and that he himself was surprised to realize it years later. But, I mean, come on. It all lines up too perfectly if you ask me. And either way, the story of Ed Gein has more or less been accepted as the inspiration for Psycho, so I'm accepting it. Around the same time, famed director Alfred Hitchcock was planning on making a movie called No Bail for the Judge. But when lead actress Audrey Hepburn became pregnant and had to gracefully exit the project, the whole thing just sort of fell through. Suddenly looking for a new project, Hitchcock's assistant Peggy Robertson suggested an adaptation of Bloch's novel, and considering Hitchcock had never made a horror film before, he jumped at the opportunity. Paramount executives, on the other hand, were less than pleased. They found the novel to be disgusting and didn't want anything to do with it. They gave Hitchcock the go-ahead, provided that he was willing to work with a much smaller budget than he had ever been given before. Because of this minuscule budget, Hitchcock filmed the whole thing in black and white, used much of the same crew from his TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and paid the actors less than their starting salary. But because he was, Alfred Hitchcock, he was still able to land big-name actors like Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins, who at the time was best known for being the lead actor in romantic movies. I've read the novel. It really isn't bad. In fact, it's very similar to the movie in a lot of ways. The biggest difference being that you get more of Norman's internal monologue, meaning that you know right off the bat that even if this guy isn't a killer, he's at least creepy. Also, the shower scene is much less iconic in the book. Mary started to scream, and then the curtains parted further, and a hand appeared, holding a butcher's knife. It was the knife that, a moment later, cut off her scream. And her head. The other big difference between the book and the movie is that in the book, Norman is described as being middle-aged, overweight, very average-looking. And in the movie, he's played by Anthony Perkins, who's, He's a cinnamon roll, okay? Fun fact, I somehow managed to watch this movie before all the discourse about, Norman Bates, mother-loving psychopath managed to reach me. So at the tender age of, 15, I spent way too much time watching this movie and hoping that he wasn't the killer because I didn't want my awkward teenage crush on him to be weird. The interesting thing about Norman Bates, in the first movie anyway, is that he isn't aware that he's the killer. He thinks that he's protecting his mother, the actual monster, and Perkins plays him with all of the emotional weight that someone in that position would have. I should hate this character. He kills women that he finds attractive because on some level, he's accepted that they're all whores and he needs to stay faithful to the one good one, his mother. But because Perkins plays him so well, I can't help but feel sorry for him. Norman is a product of his upbringing more than anything. He's a monster, sure, but more than that, he's mentally ill and in desperate need of help that he just won't get in the 1960s when we were still using words like transvestite.
He's a transvestite.
Norman Bates is easily one of the best villains of all time. Not even just of horror, just of all time. And him not only being sympathetic, but charming, I think works better than the novel's depiction of him as, just a normal-looking, open misogynist. I think I've already made it clear that I would have been easily lured in by movie Norman, and then promptly gotten, how did the book phrase it again? Cut off her scream. And her head. It makes it scarier when you can see yourself becoming the next victim. But it also just makes the character more interesting to have layers. Book Norman was fucked from the beginning. He was always going to be gross and unlikable. But movie Norman had a chance. It didn't have to be like this. You were so sweet and cinnamon rolly. Can we go back to that? Norman, stop. But then there's also moments like when Norman discovers Marion's corpse and he immediately starts cleaning it up. When I first watched this movie back when I was 15, I found this scene to be overly long and boring. Like, come on, we get it. He's cleaning up a murder scene. Can we move on to, actual murders? But watching this movie back as an adult, I realized that this scene is exactly as long as it needs to be. It really makes you realize how quick Norman is to act, and how unemotional and detached he can be while performing this gruesome act. At this point, the movie is trying to communicate that even if Norman wasn't the one to hold the knife, he's still willing to go to disgusting and dehumanizing lengths to cover it up. And he can do it all without batting an eye, without crying or screaming at mother like he does in the book. Here he's just cold, an unfeeling monster, completely different from the warm but sad boy that we saw before this. You gotta hand it to Perkins. He goes through an entire emotional range in this movie, from childlike innocence to screaming madman to cold, hard fury, and he plays it all perfectly. Now, of course, there is some controversy about Norman's, entire existence, and since I'm covering this in Pride Month, I'm gonna talk about that. As the movie describes it, Norman dressing up in women's clothing does not indicate that he is gay, transgender, or even a drag queen, simply that he's taken on a mother persona because of his mental illness. But regardless, the way that it's presented in the movie, it's very clear that it wants you to accept that men dressed in women's clothing are weird, if not dangerous. Like, regardless of whether or not Norman is attracted to women, it's obvious what they're trying to evoke here. Imagine being a 1960s audience member with absolutely no understanding of gender or sexuality and seeing this. That's all I'm saying. There also seems to be something interesting going on in the fact that it's Norman's mother personality that kills people. She's more dominant than him, and presumably she's the one that turned Norman into what he is today. To put it in modern day terms, this movie expresses fear about the kind of beta male cuck that the feminists want to turn us, you, all into. There definitely is this interpretation that a man's place is not as submissive to a woman, and that by forcing this dynamic, that will somehow turn you into a cross-dressing homicidal maniac. And I will acknowledge that I see that in this movie, and it is not a message that I'm overly comfortable with. But as someone who just loves good, complex villains, I can't help but love Norman Bates regardless. And if my word isn't enough, it is very difficult to say what sexuality Anthony Perkins would have identified with. We know that he had relationships with both men and women, but only he could have given us a straight-out identifier, and unfortunately he passed away from AIDS in 1992. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to refer to Anthony Perkins as a queer man. And Perkins himself loved the character of Norman Bates for just how complex and sympathetic he was. Sure, Perkins hated being typecasted. He had a very hard time going back to being the lead and love interest in movies after this. But he never had a bad word to say about the character himself, and was even willing to come back for 3 sequels later. More on that in a little bit. And that doesn't excuse the messages behind this movie. I'm still very uncomfortable with the way that it demonizes gender non-conforming people and mentally ill people. In general, Psycho was a very shocking movie when it came out. It was one of the first movies to break the rules of the dreaded Hays Code, and if you don't know what that is, it was the code that was supposed to give moral guidelines to all Hollywood movies. It ran with varying enforcement between 1934 and 1968, and it had a heavy emphasis on traditional gender roles and punishing those evil homosexuals. So even things like, I don't know, there being a toilet on screen was huge for Hollywood at the time. No joke, this is the first time that a toilet ever appeared in a movie. But even things like Norman being gender non-conforming, or Marion and Sam appearing in bed together at one point despite not being married, were hugely shocking things. And not to mention, dat gore though. Psycho has been credited as the first slasher movie, literally ever. After its release, horror films started to get a lot bloodier and a lot sexier. So I guess we have Psycho to thank for a Serbian film. Great. But also you get more normal things like Jason going on his whole
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die.
And I haven't even mentioned all the little things that this movie gets right. Like Marion imagining all the things that people must be saying about her, all while driving to that building music, conveying her anxiety. And then there's the fact that Psycho doesn't really have a protagonist. They keep introducing options, but then, oop, they're dead. Normally I'd protest to this in a movie because spending such little time with a character means that you don't really get a chance to get attached. But here I feel like we spend enough time with, well, Marion at least, that we do care about her, and we care about the other characters by proxy of her. They're either attached to her in some way, or they're trying to solve her murder. We care about them because we want justice for Marion. Hitchcock had a reputation for being a perfectionist, and it shows in every little detail, right down to the color of Marion's bra, white at the beginning of the movie and black after she steals the money. I could literally sit here and write a book report about the symbolic significance of every scene. It's that tight. But let's be real, if I did that, then this review would be a million years long. If there is one scene in this movie that's kinda weak, then it's the ending, where the psychiatrist is explaining exactly what's wrong with Norman. Hitchcock hated this scene. In fact, he hated all the scenes, as perfectionists tend to do with their work. But here I can kinda see what he meant. He felt that it was too wordy, and that it dragged the movie down when everything had been action before this. And the golden rule in writing is show, don't tell, but I don't really know how they would have shown this except in flashback, and a sudden flashback scene would have felt very out of place with this movie's tone. So yeah, I don't really know what to do with this. All in all, the movie's weak points are vastly overshadowed by the movie's strong points. I love this movie. I cannot state that enough. I know it's problematic, I know it isn't perfect, but I still find myself going back to it all the time, and I have nothing but respect for the legacy it left behind. And as I said, Perkins went on to make 3 sequels, so I guess I'll be reviewing those next. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel and click that little bell thingy to get notified. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and while you're down there, why don't you leave me a comment? Let me know how you think Psycho holds up. Thank you so much for watching, my pets, and I will see you next time. Love you.